For years, a criminal's whereabouts or even their identity can be a mystery to law enforcement, leading them on a wild goose chase to catch their perpetrator. What often stuns even the most seasoned law enforcement officials is investigating someone who is regarded as a pillar of their community. Whether that person is a religious figure or a prominent businessman, it's always a shock to find out that the person you once trusted was hiding a dark side. Number 5. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy was a successful businessman with a loving wife and a promising future ahead of him. Gacy was a manager of several KFC restaurants in and around Chicago, Illinois, and also worked as a clown at children's birthday parties and other functions. Members of the community couldn't hold him in high enough regard, boasting about how much their kids enjoyed his parties and what a wonderful entertainer he was. Little did they know that Gacy was living a double life underneath his clown suit. Gacy had even gained a small political standing after joining the Democrats. He was well regarded within the local community for his political services and at one point held the title of Director of Chicago's annual Polished Constitution Day Parade. This accolade allowed him to meet with the First Lady, Rosalind Carter, in a photograph dated May 6, 1978. Gacy can be seen standing with the First Lady wearing an S pin badge, which meant that he had special service clearance and was not deemed a security threat. It all started to fall apart for Gacy when his victim's family, the Peasts, filed a missing persons report after their son had not returned home. When police investigated his disappearance, they learned that while Robert was on shift at the pharmacy where he worked, he was approached by Gacy, asking him if he wanted some extra money to work with him in his painting and decorating business. Robert agreed and the pair left in Gacy's car. When police ran Gacy through their system, they found that he had previous assault charges. Concerned that Robert was in danger, police asked Gacy to come to the police station. However, his actions were noted as being very odd. At first he refused and then turned up at 2:30 a.m., covered in mud, claiming to have been involved in an accident. A day later, and armed with a search warrant, officers arrived at the house to conduct a full-scale search. Inside Gacy's property, they found weapons, handcuffs, and many other alarming pieces of evidence, but this wasn't enough to convict Gacy of any crime. Police continued to search and investigate Gacy, and finally, on December 20th, he cracked. He drove to the office of his attorney and confessed everything in a long and rambling statement. Gacy told him everything before falling asleep due to a large amount of alcohol he had consumed. In turn, the police were called and Gacy's crimes began to unravel. Police obtained a warrant to search his house and found the bodies of numerous young men buried in his garden and in the crawl space beneath his home. In all, Gacy had claimed the lives of 33 men and was given capital punishment. Following his arrest and conviction, his time in political office and his involvement with the parade became a smear on Chicago, Illinois. The U.S. Secret Service would go on to say how this meeting with the First Lady Carter was one of the most embarrassing events in history. Number 4. There are few professionals held in such high regard as doctors or nurses, the people who care for us when we are ill and provide us with health care for our various ailments throughout our lives. While hospitals can be a source of fear and anxiety for some, for others they're a place of treatment filled with individuals who want nothing but the best for you and your health. Dr. Harold Shipman's GP practice on 21 Market Street in Hyde, Greater Manchester was no exception. In the UK, it takes around 10 years for some to train to become a GP, and that's not before setting A levels and possibly taking entrance exams to prestigious and respected universities. It's not a career path for the faint-hearted, and not a path that some people take without much consideration. This is why people trusted Dr. Shipman. He'd started his path to becoming a GP after he witnessed his mother pass away from lung cancer. It was this event that spurred Dr. Shipman on to help those in his community. In the early 1980s, he was able to open his own surgery on 21 Market Street and had a plethora of regular patients. The majority of his patients were either elderly or had multiple health issues that required regular visits to his office, and most of his patients had nothing but nice things to say about him. They would always comment on how he was always listening to their issues and concerns. For the people of Hyde, Dr. Shipman was someone they could trust. After all, he was a doctor and had devoted his life to the care of others, but underneath his caring exterior, Dr. Shipman was hiding a secret. In 1998, the South Manchester District Coroner's Office was tipped off by another GP in the Hyde area about a large number of deaths under Dr. Shipman's care. The GP was concerned at not only the rates but the instances of elderly women who had been cremated, and those cremation forms had been signed by none other than Dr. Shipman. Following a more thorough investigation, it was found that Shipman had also been the beneficiary of many of his patients, with some leaving behind large sums of money. In one case, a victim left him $386,000 in her will and had nothing left to her children or remaining family. It transpired that Dr. Shipman had forced his elderly patients into signing over everything to him in his will before he would administer them fatal doses of drugs such as diamorphine or insulin. This investigation also uncovered that Dr. Shipman had been falsifying health records to indicate that his patients had been in a decline of health for the weeks and months leading up to their passing. Dr. Shipman hoped that by tampering with records, regulatory bodies would not catch on, especially considering that most of his patients were elderly and frail. Dr. Shipman is considered to be Britain's most prolific angel of death. If you speak to anyone from Hyde, they'll likely be able to tell you a story about Dr. Shipman, whether they personally have been affected or they knew someone who has. Greater Manchester Police estimated that Dr. Shipman had over 215 victims, but that number could be much higher, as he worked in various doctor's surgeries and healthcare settings during his career. Dr. Shipman was sentenced to life in prison under a whole life order, something that is reserved for only the most dangerous individuals in England. He passed away in HM Prison Wakefield on January 13, 2004. Number 3. Much like doctors and nurses, we're told to trust police from a very early age. Our parents will often explain to us that the police are there to help us, and should we ever be in an emergency, that they're the first people we should call. But what if a police officer turns out to be a criminal that everyone is hunting? That's the case with Mikhail Papkov. Often dubbed the werewolf or the Angharst maniac, Mikhail Papkov is known as Russia's most prolific serial killer. He worked as a police officer in Angharst and was responsible for the protection of its citizens. He took his job very seriously and was devoted to his job, but in 1992, he took advantage of the status and power that he held and used it for his own means. He would drive around at night in his police car, dressed in uniform and operating under the guise of offering drunk women a ride. He would circle areas where young people would hang out and promise them a safe ride home, as he noticed they were inebriated, out in the cold and alone late at night. Of course, these women trusted him as he was a police officer and were often surprised that he wasn't there to arrest them. When the women were inside of his car, he would strike, attacking them using various methods before getting rid of their bodies in desolated areas of Russia. The very vehicle that he used to gain the trust of his victims was also his downfall. When investigating the string of murders, police noticed that the crime scenes shared a common feature: tire tracks from a 4x4 Lada, a car that was used by police officers in Russia. Upon learning this, the police obtained a warrant to test the DNA of 3,500 police officers in the area, which led them straight to Mikhail Papkov. At the time of his arrest, he was no longer working for the police, but he was a former officer, so they had the right to obtain his DNA. He was formally charged with 78 counts of murder and has confessed for being responsible for over 83, a claim that makes him Russia's most prolific serial killer. At the time he was active, not only was he working as an officer, but he was married and helping his wife raise their infant daughter. For his crimes, he was sentenced to life in prison and is currently serving his sentence at a hard labor colony. Number 2. Ted Bundy appeared to be the all-American man. Charming and charismatic, Bundy was able to woo all of his victims into trusting him, along with everyone else in his life. On the outside, Ted appeared to have it all going for him. He was good looking and had secured a place at the University of Washington to study Chinese. However, it was during this time at the University of Washington that Ted's true self began to come to the forefront. While he was studying at the university, he began dating a girl known as Stephanie Brooks, and Ted fell completely head over heels for Stephanie, and she became the dominating factor in his life. Everything he did was for her, to help secure a better future for them both. The pair were even engaged. However, Stephanie broke the relationship off, and he was devastated, causing his whole world to crash down around him. A psychiatrist later commented on this event, saying this was probably the pivotal time in his development. It took Ted some time, but in the early 1970s, he had gotten his head together and decided to go back to university, this time studying psychology. His second time around at university proved to be much more successful than his first, after he had matured and gained wisdom with age. Ted was able to flourish and become an honors student. During his time, Ted volunteered at the Seattle Hotline Crisis Center, where he was held in high regard by his colleagues. He worked alongside former police officer Anne Rule, who would later go on to write The Stranger Beside Me about her time with Bundy. Her book has now become an infamous and invaluable contribution to the true crime community and describes Ted as a kind, solicitous, and empathetic person. Little did Anne Rule know that she was sat beside one of the USA's most prolific serial killers, and that while he was operating under the facade of a caring, compassionate psychology student by day, he was a serial killer by night. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy claimed the lives of 30 women, although that number could be much higher. He embarked on a crime spree across California, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, thinking that this would help him evade capture as police forces in different states are known for their lack of communication. However, his cockiness would be his downfall. Little did he know that police across these states had begun working together after noticing similarities in the crimes that he had committed. He was eventually charged and acted in his own defense during his various court cases, displaying his narcissistic tendencies and attempting to charm the judge and jury. Number 1. Dennis Lynn Rader, often known as BTK, is the perfect example of a serial killer who was able to lead a double life successfully, and had it not been for his own arrogance, he would have gotten away with it. Rader served in the Air Force during the 1960s and had settled down in Wichita, Kansas, where he got married and had children. Much like Bundy, Rader was living the American dream. He had a nice house, a nice car, was married with children, and had a good career. Rader worked for ADT, a security company who specializes in home security. To this day, many people still use ADT, and their name and logo can be seen on burglar alarms on many houses around the world. It was also during this time as a technician with ADT that Rader would plan his murders. He would use his position as a burglar technician to gain his customers' trusts, all the while being able to look around their homes without arousing suspicion. Rader was also an active member of his local church and was a Boy Scout leader. When he was first arrested, people believed it was a mistake. They joked about how Rader was too plain and boring to be the infamous BTK, who had terrorized Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991. Little did these people know that they'd been face to face with the man who would later be convicted of 10 counts of murder. Rader had taken a large cooling-off period between his various crimes, and he later explained that this was in order to care for his 2 children, showing a sense of control and level-headedness that is seldom seen in most killers. However, much like many of them, Rader's own grandiose sense of self and cocky attitude was the very thing that led to his capture. During the early 2000s, and in the advent of the internet and computer age, Rader began sending letters to Wichita police, taunting them that they had not yet caught him. In his game of cat and mouse, Rader had asked police whether or not they would be able to trace information from a floppy disk if he sent them one. Police replied to the BTK that they would not, and that a floppy disk would be a safe and secure way to send further information. Unbeknownst to Rader, the police were able to track the metadata hidden within a deleted file on the disk. The data contained Christ Lutheran Church and showed that the document was last edited by someone named Dennis. It only took a quick search for police to ascertain that someone by the name of Dennis Rader was the president of the Christ Lutheran Church, and armed with this information, they were able to move in. Police were able to obtain a DNA sample from Rader in a very roundabout way. Instead of directly approaching Rader themselves, letting him know that the game was up, the police were able to use a sample from his daughter, Carrie, which was obtained by the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. When tested, the sample from his daughter showed that they were a familial match to DNA obtained from the BTK victims, and police finally had solid evidence that they could use to arrest Dennis Rader. For over 20 years, BTK had evaded police capture, but it was a floppy disk and pure arrogance that ended his criminal career. Dennis Rader was convicted of 10 counts of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 175 years. He's currently serving his sentence at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.